Hello everyone, WallaceMan105 here today, and I want to go over the way that I would like for the eventual minecart overhaul in the works to eventually go. Before we begin, I want to talk briefly about these tools being introduced in 24W33A and some of the knee-jerk reactions of the community. If you check the feedback page for the changes, there's a bunch of people just spamming revert the changes, and I feel like that means they really don't fully understand what's going on right now. What's happening with these experiments isn't a set of changes they're considering implementing. It's the first draft of an entirely new engine or code base for minecarts writ large. These are the first steps, and we're still probably at least a year away from any real implementation into the game. Think about how long the bundle has been in experiments, and that's just like one item. And for those complaining about broken contraptions, something to keep in mind is that a lot of the things we do with minecarts weren't things they were designed to do in the first place. They're essentially based off of bugs. Things like all corner tracks or piston bolts were never design features of minecarts, they were side effect of poor coding. On a recent Inspector Talon video, which I'll link up in the corner, going over the changes, there was a Minecraft dev in the comment section. And they laid out in no uncertain terms that the existing code base for carts was completely unmaintainable. The options they had were to A, leave it as is forever and risk it breaking in a future update and not being able to fix it, or B, start from scratch. There were no real small tweaks available to them that would, be acceptable for their coding standards. So we as a community probably shouldn't clamor for changes for years and then lose our minds when the rough draft of those changes breaks a bunch of bug-based builds. Because this set of changes is basically a full rewrite, they're likely just not able to change a setting and turn a new behavior back into an old one. Those adjustments will take time and trial and error. And for the record, I think the cart snapping in the new stuff is probably what makes it so hard for carts to derail. So there'd be a trade-off if they just get rid of that. But now, to get into today's real topic. I have been thinking about this for a long time, reading threads, watching videos, trying out mods and plugins, and at the end of the day, I've narrowed it down to two big issues that hold minecarts back from being a compelling transportation option compared to the other choices. A lack of precision and a lack of scaling. Simply put, for the lack of scaling, what I mean by that is rails you build in the early game are not going to be fundamentally different from rails you build in the late game. So there's no ceiling to go up. They're all the same. The changes and additions I'm proposing here are meant to patch those two holes in the mechanics while still, maintaining flow and parity with the rest of Minecraft's gameplay. To start with, there's one big problem with minecarts, and it's the fact that the same thing controls speeding up and speeding down. Powered rails, depending on their power state, either speed you up or slow you down. Having the acceleration and deceleration in one block is a key weakness to the precision of minecarts. For example, the amount that they slow you down and the amount that they speed you up are tied together. You can't quite separate those. You can only multiply it under the existing structure. If they're going to do a full rewrite, they should make the most of that by separating acceleration and deceleration into two different rails. And I've got here kind of rough drafts for how I think this could work. Both of these rails would essentially be the same, one made with copper, one made with amethyst shards. And you would set them out at the beginning of a segment of powered rails, right? So what they would do is you would set from 1 to 64 by filling the rail, because this would be a container block, not just a regular rail. But you would fill them 1 to 64 with the item that they're made of. So in this case, you would fill a calibrated booster with up to 64 copper ingots. Each one of these copper ingots would relate to 1 meter per second or 1 block per second of speed. So that would be the targeted acceleration going forward for the powered rails on this segment. They would try to boost you up to that speed. Currently, the way that powered rails handle acceleration is based on the amount of time in-game ticks that a minecart spends on top of them. So this could be something where the amount they add per tick is increased to try and get you to that speed. I think 64 meters per second is a fairly compelling max speed for minecarts, and I'll get into that a bit more later. Now, the calibrated brakes would do the opposite. So you would fill them up with amethyst shards, and that would control what speed they try and bring you down to. Now, this is important that it be 1 to 64 for both functions, because that would allow you to target a precise speed. Allowing players to set a precise speed fills the gap in precision that you lose when you get rid of piston bolts. Now, it would probably work in a way where a minecart going faster than the calibrated booster would not be accelerated by these rails at all. It just wouldn't have its speed taken away. And something traveling slower than the calibrated brake, for example, if this is set to slow something down to 20 meters per second and a cart coming 10 meters per second crosses it, you wouldn't want it to have an effect there either. But separating these two functions and allowing them to be specifically set by the player is how you would make it a very precise and compelling system to use. Directional precision is another weakness of the existing minecart systems. So right now, we do have corner rails, which can be designed to go, or they can have their orientation changed with, redstone powering on and off. However, in this configuration, there's nothing you'd be able to do in terms of changing their direction. They're going to ignore any signal sent in once they're in a four-way pattern. They can't just be flipped. So a cross rail would be a good addition to fill this gap. And this will go hand in hand with the next improvement, but essentially, as the player is coming through, it could be set to be north-south or east-west, as opposed to being, held in place by the southeast rule of existing corner rails. The way that this would work, at least in my version of the system, is a control cart, which you would take a lever, a minecart, and a tripwire to make this, and essentially, while you're in the cart, currently holding W or S allows you to move very slowly. However, A and D, left and right, are kind of left out of the party. So it would make sense if a control cart would allow the player to hold A or hold D to change select which direction they want to go through in an upcoming cross rail. This kind of control and precision would be most useful in the early game, and great for manual cart systems that use perhaps furnace carts or very few powered rails and operate at low speeds. The next thing, do I even need to say it out loud? I mean, you can see what I want. Mojang knows we want this. This would be the single most compelling thing about minecarts if implemented. I have been working with a plugin over the past several months that allows a version of this, but doing this in the base game, it's not a very clean implementation. You're very limited in what you're really able to do with this, just because, carts are poorly coded, and you're trying to make a patchwork system on top of that. So having an actual in-game version of this would be so much more powerful. Speaking of uses for trains, linked carts is pretty much the only way furnace carts are going to be useful again. Being able to build manual tracks out of standard rails with furnace minecarts would be the early game system of transportation that you really need, because you can't really use minecarts without powered rails right now, and that requires a substantial supply of gold, which is a fairly rare resource, especially in the early and mid game. It's not until the late game where you're really able to farm it, or you have high level gear that you're able to, use with fortune, that gold becomes a sustainable resource. So improving the furnace minecart and allowing it to work better, especially because shunting is now completely gone and broken in the existing experiment, which, good riddance, that's really the only way forward for early game support. In the interest of that, I would propose fuel-dependent minecart speeds for the furnace cart. So depending on what fuel you put it in, they would all have the same duration, but they would run for different speeds. So you'd start with charcoal at 2 meters per second, coal would be 4, redstone dust would be 8, blaze rods would be 16, and lava buckets would be 32 meters per second. It's also important to note that a GUI and an inventory that the player can access for furnace minecarts is a bare minimum for any kind of system like this. Without being able to properly control it, it's really just not a useful mechanic. Now, in the same vein, something a lot of people have recommended, and I've kind of Frankenstein together here, is a blast furnace cart. In my opinion, if this kind of system were implemented, you would want it so that blast carts are either 50% faster or hold their fuel for 50% longer compared to regular furnace minecarts. So they're either more fuel efficient or faster. Next up here, I have some more minor or fun ideas that I would love to see implemented. We've had chest minecarts, then we got barrels implemented into the game, and we don't have barrel minecarts. So I think that that'd be a pretty fun addition, and if you made barrel minecarts that had the typical 27 inventory slots, you could perhaps make it so chest minecarts have additional, maybe not a full double chest 54 size slot, but maybe 36 or 45. Also, cauldron minecarts would be kind of fun as a way to transport water sources or lava sources. This could be something that maybe they're able to irrigate crops, or maybe putting them over an activator rail will cause them to spill their water or lava out to the side as a way of deploying it. I could see this having a farming use, maybe in the same vein that TNT minecarts have a farming use. And it would just be a pretty fun method to use. And least useful, most fun out of these three is a jukebox minecart. I really have no particular use for this, and I don't necessarily have the creativity to envision one, but a note block or jukebox minecart would be just a kind of a fun thing to have. Maybe one that plays its notes based on activator rails, so that you could have a song play with pretty precise timing. Next up, I want to go over a visual issue that's bugged me for years. In this existing layout, a minecart will push itself and enter from the outside curve of this rail. It would be so nice if these bits of rail here connected as a branch kind of thing, just to show players in a visual means that, yes, this is how this works. Because right now, it's not necessarily intuitive to a beginning player that this would work. So that would just be a good way to clean up the visuals of the cart. Also over here, this is probably one of the other most critical complaints of minecarts, is you can deploy them with dispensers, but you have to have this cactus set up here to break them reliably. And it's not good. This requires a 4x1 area because you have to have something on top of the cactus to prevent it from growing or being walked into. You have to have sand underneath it, and you have to have a block underneath that sand. It's not tidy. I've seen loads of suggestions from this for this, from allowing dispensers to pick up minecarts off of tracks if they're placed below. or using a super activator rail that doesn't just kick out players but also breaks carts. I don't know exactly what the perfect answer to this would be, but it ain't this. We need a better cart retrieval method than this cactus one. Speaking of other existing mechanics, demonstrating momentum here in carts, this chest cart is empty and this chest cart is full. And so we have an unoccupied and now an occupied cart here. If I deploy these, you can see the difference in momentum between them. This is going to reach that first, and then we'll reach it second. And based on the load that's in the cart, so kind of a weight and momentum mechanic, that's going to determine how far the minecarts go. And how fast they get there. I think this is good and should remain in, but perhaps could use a little bit of refinement to make things more consistent across the board. Because this is one of those things where you build a minecart track and you ride on it as a player, and it's very, it's very reliable when you'll slow down, when you'll speed up, how fast you need to go to make a turn or make it to your next powered rail. But then you go and load a chest minecart with items, and it's not as far. An empty chest cart goes just as nearly as far as an occupied minecart. So a full passenger and an empty chest are the winners, and then the losers are a full chest and an empty passenger cart. I think that that's a little counterintuitive, because an empty passenger cart, and an empty freight cart, so to speak, they're polar opposites. And I feel like maybe it should be flipped so that an empty container cart and an empty passenger cart have more similar behavior, and then a full cart and a occupied passenger cart have similar behavior. And then last but not least, I want to cover here some issues of speed with minecarts. So currently, minecarts at top speed move 8 meters per second, and furnace minecarts move 4 meters per second. Hoppers collect items at 2.5 items per second, whereas hopper carts collect items at a speed of 20 per second. These two throughputs limit how fast you would want to make carts in a given system. This ties back into what I was saying about allowing players to have a very precise speed and slowdown system. You really wouldn't want to have it be only 64 meters per second, or only 2 meters per second, or only 10 meters per second. Because if you set it so that way you can only go a certain speed, there's always going to be a conflict with redstone components that don't move at that speed. 20 meters per second seems like a pretty good compromise if you were to go for a single speed available for all minecarts. Just because 20 meters per second for minecarts and 20 ticks per second per redstone kind of work out pretty well. It feels like it'd be easy to achieve a system-wide parity for those mechanics. Now, that's just about going to sum up my take on how I would like to see a minecart overhaul turn out. But obviously, everybody in the community is going to have a slightly different way of, wanting things to go. So if you're watching this, please let me know any feedback you have on my ideas down in the comments. And please go to the feedback site for these changes. I will leave a link in the description. But go to the feedback site and leave constructive feedback. Don't just yell revert or implement today or I hate you or I love you. Put in actual constructive feedback, test results you have, behaviors you'd like to see, and really try to be constructive here. We're being given a pretty rare opportunity as a community to have our feedback heard in real time by the developers working on these features, and we should not waste it. We should encourage it by being productive and constructive in these conversations. So guys, that'll be about it. And until next time, this has been Wallace. And remember to take it easy. Oh, and if any Mojang developers are watching this, please reach out to me. I would so love to do a little Q&A on this system and maybe inform the community a little bit. So yeah, see you.